She was standing in the middle of the road, soaking wet, with a suitcase in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. She looked up at me with those storm-gray eyes and said the 7 words that changed my entire life. "I think I've come to the wrong place." The sky had been lying to me all afternoon. It started as one of those pale, deceptive autumn days in the Wyoming Territory, the kind where the sun hangs low and golden, where the sage smells sweet, and the wind is soft enough to trick a man into thinking the world is gentle. I had been riding the fence line along the north pasture since early morning, checking posts, tightening wire, doing the 10,000 small and thankless chores that kept the Callaway Ranch alive and breathing through another season. My horse, a black quarter horse named Soot, had been restless all morning, turning his ears sideways, snorting at nothing. I should have listened to him. Animals always know before people do. By 3 in the afternoon, the clouds had stacked themselves on the western horizon like a dark army preparing for war. They were the particular color of a bruised, deep purple-gray at the belly, greenish-yellow at the edges, and they were moving fast. I had seen enough Wyoming storms to know that this one meant business. The temperature dropped 8 degrees in the space of 20 minutes. The wind shifted, turned cold and mean, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall just as I turned Soot back toward the barn. I put my heels to him, and he didn't need any convincing. He ran. I was still half a mile from the homestead when the storm broke open. It didn't rain so much as attack. The water came sideways, driven by a wind that roared and pressed against my chest like a physical force. Lightning cracked somewhere close enough that I felt the charge of it in my teeth, and Soot shied hard to the left, nearly throwing me from the saddle. I grabbed his mane with one hand and the saddle horn with the other, swearing through clenched teeth, and I brought him back around. We were both soaked through in seconds. The dirt road ahead turned to mud before my eyes, channels of brown water cutting new rivers across the familiar ground, and the world reduced itself to a narrow circle of gray rain and roaring wind. That was when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the road, just standing there in the full force of the storm, with a leather suitcase in one hand and a piece of paper clutched in the other. She was wearing a dark blue traveling dress that was plastered to her body by the rain, and her hair, whatever color it had been when dry, was black with water and streaming down across her face and shoulders. She was not running for cover. She was not crouching down or turning her back to the wind. She was simply standing there, looking down at the paper in her hand, as though the storm were something happening in another world, and she was too busy being lost to notice it. I pulled Soot to a halt 10 feet from her. He tossed his head and danced sideways in the driving rain. She looked up. Even through the curtain of rain, even in that furious half-dark afternoon, I felt something happen inside my chest, some small, quiet shift, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. Her eyes were gray. Not the pale, washed-out gray of a winter sky, but deep gray, the color of storm clouds from the inside, the color of the ocean in old paintings. They were wide with what I could see, even from horseback, was not quite fear. It was something more complicated than fear. It was the look of a person who has just realized that every plan they made has come undone, and who is standing in the ruins of those plans, trying to decide whether to cry or to simply keep breathing. She looked at me for one long-held moment. Then she said it. "I think I've come to the wrong place." Her voice was steady. That was the thing that got me first, not her face, not her eyes, not the way she looked standing in that storm like a woman in a painting. It was the steadiness of her voice. The rain was hammering the earth around her. The lightning was splitting the sky, and she said those 7 words in a voice that was almost calm. Almost. The tremor underneath it was small, but I heard it, and it told me everything the steadiness was trying to hide. I swung down from the saddle. "Ma'am," I said, my voice raised over the roar of the storm, "I don't know where you're trying to go, but you cannot stand in the middle of this road. Come with me." She looked at the paper in her hand. Then she looked at me. Her jaw was set with a pride that I recognized even then, the pride of a person who does not ask for help, who has never needed to, who finds the necessity of it almost unbearable. "I don't know you," she said. "No," I said, "but you're going to drown standing there. Come with me." Another crack of lightning. This one turned the sky white for a full 3 seconds, and in that white light I saw her face clearly for the first time, the high cheekbones, the full mouth pressed into a line of determined calm, the rain running freely down the curve of her jaw. She was young, 22, 23 at most, and she was, even soaked and lost and stranded in a Wyoming storm, one of the most striking women I had ever seen. She looked at the paper one more time. Then she folded it, tucked it inside her coat with a gesture of finality that somehow felt like grief, and she picked up her suitcase. "All right," she said, "lead the way." The ranch house was dark when we arrived. I had no one waiting for me, no wife, no family, no hired hands who lived on the property. My foreman, a quiet Lakota man named Thomas Littlebird, kept his own small cabin 2 miles east and came to work at dawn. The house itself was a solid, low-built structure of timber and stone that my father had built with his own hands 20 years ago, and it had the particular atmosphere of a place that is well-made and well-kept but privately, deeply lonely. I was aware of that loneliness more sharply than usual as I pushed open the front door and held it for her. She stopped in the doorway. She was dripping water onto the threshold, her suitcase hanging from one hand, her hair hanging in ropes around her face. She looked at the inside of the house, at the fireplace, dark and cold, at the wooden table, at the single chair pulled up beside the window, and something in her expression shifted. I couldn't read it clearly. It might have been relief. It might have been a different kind of grief. "There's a bedroom at the end of the hall," I said. "You can dry off and change. I'll get a fire started." She turned to look at me. "You live here alone?" "Yes." She considered this. "And you're not," she stopped herself, started again. "What is your name?" "Eli Calloway," I said. "This is the Calloway Ranch." She went very still. The fire I was building, I had crouched in front of the hearth with tinder and flint, stopped being built, because I turned to look at her, because her stillness was the kind that demands attention. "Calloway," she repeated. "Yes." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, that storm-gray gaze had taken on a quality that I would come to know well over the coming weeks, a particular kind of controlled composure, the kind that costs something to maintain. "My name is June Hartwell," she said. "I came here on the stage from Cheyenne. I was supposed to be met," she paused, "by a man named Robert Calloway." The flint went quiet in my hand. Robert Calloway was my brother, my younger brother, who had 6 months ago placed an advertisement in a newspaper out of Cheyenne seeking a bride, and who had, 5 months ago, received a reply from a woman in Missouri, and who had, 3 months ago, exchanged enough letters with that woman to reach an arrangement, and who had 2 months ago been thrown from his horse in the south pasture while I was in Laramie picking up supplies, and who had been buried on the hill behind the house under a white-painted wooden cross before I even made it home. Robert had been 24 years old. I had not answered her letters. I hadn't known about them until Thomas found the bundle in Robert's desk drawer weeks after the burial, by which point I had assumed the arrangement was simply over, that the woman would be notified by the stage line or the post office, or simply by the absence of any response, that something had gone wrong and the arrangement was dissolved. I had not thought, in my grief and my practical preoccupation with keeping the ranch from falling apart without my brother's labor, to find out her name and write to her. It had not occurred to me that a woman would simply board a stage, come all this way, alone, into a storm. "I see," June Hartwell said, and her voice was again that terrible practiced calm. She had read something in my face. "I have never been good at hiding things in my expression. He's dead, isn't he?" It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," I said. 2 months ago I should have written, I should have sent word. I am deeply sorry." She stood there for a long moment, holding her suitcase, rain still dripping from the hem of her skirt onto the floorboards of my father's house. The storm outside was building to its full fury now. I could hear the timber of the roof protesting, the windows rattling in their frames, the sound of the wind rising from a roar to something that felt almost like screaming. Then she set her suitcase down. Not with force, not with anger, though God knows she had the right to anger. She set it down gently, with the careful deliberateness of a person who is managing something very large and very fragile inside themselves. "May I sit down?" she asked. "Of course," I said, "please." I got the fire going. It took 3 attempts because my hands were not entirely steady, and when the flames finally caught and began to spread warm, orange light through the room, I felt the tightness in my chest ease slightly. I put the kettle on and went to the bedroom to find a dry blanket, which I brought back and held out to her without comment. She took it with a murmured thank you and drew it around her shoulders, and we sat, she in the chair by the fire, I on the edge of the table, a careful and respectful distance between us, while the storm threw itself against the walls of the house and the fire crackled and the water boiled. She said nothing for a long time. I did not push her. There are things that need silence the way wounds need air. Finally she spoke. "I sold everything," she said quietly. "My furniture, my mother's dishes, my winter coat." A pause. "I thought," she stopped, began again. "He wrote very kind letters." "He was a kind man," I said, and I meant it. Robert had been the kind, open-hearted one, the one who smiled easily and remembered everyone's name and made people feel, without effort, that they mattered. I was the other kind, the quiet kind, the kind that gets the work done and doesn't say much and keeps his feelings behind his back like cards he's not ready to play. June looked at me across the fire. "You are his brother." "Yes." "You don't look like him." A pause. "From the photograph he sent." "No," I agreed, "we didn't." Another silence. The fire popped and settled. "I can't go back," she said, not complaining, just stating a fact with the plainness of a woman who has looked the situation square in the face and is refusing to flinch from it. "I spent the last of my money on the stage ticket. I have," she checked herself. "I have very little." "You'll stay here tonight," I said. "The storm won't break until morning. After that we'll figure out the rest." She looked at me steadily. "That is a generous offer from a man who doesn't know me." "You came a long way because of my family's failure to notify you," I said. "The least I can do is keep you dry." Something moved in her expression, something small and quick, gone before I could name it. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and turned back to the fire. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," she said. "Eli," I said, before I had quite decided to say it. She looked at me again, and this time that small, quick thing in her expression stayed long enough for me to see what it was. It was not gratitude, exactly. It was something closer to recognition, the particular look of a person who has been spoken to by someone who means what they say, and who is surprised to find that it still exists in the world. "June," she said quietly. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the fire burned. And something, too small to name yet, too new to trust, began. The storm broke at dawn. I was already awake. I am always awake before dawn, have been since my father put the habit into me at age 7, telling me that the ranch was alive and needed tending before it could tend you, and I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and listened to the world go quiet outside. The wind dropped first, then the rain, until there was only the soft, patient sound of water dripping from the eaves and the distant, satisfied rumble of the storm moving east to trouble someone else. When June appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, she had changed into dry clothes, a simple brown dress, practical and plain, and her hair was braided over one shoulder. She had, I noticed, managed to sleep despite everything, because there was a softness around her eyes that wasn't there the night before, a slight unreachedness in her expression that told me she had, for a few hours at least, been somewhere other than the wreckage of her plans. "Good morning," she said. "Coffee's hot," I said. She sat across from me at the table and we drank coffee in the gray, washed morning light, and the silence between us was not uncomfortable. That surprised me. I have spent most of my adult life more comfortable with silence than with talk, but the silences of solitude and the silences between two people are different things, and the difference is not always kind. This one was. It had a quality of mutual recognition. Two people acknowledging, without saying so, that they have both arrived at the same difficult morning from different directions, and that coffee is a reasonable place to start. "What will you do?" she asked finally. I had been thinking about it since before she woke up. The honest answer was that I didn't know. The ranch needed labor. Robert had been a full partner in its operation, and his absence had left a gap that Thomas Littlebird and I had been struggling to fill through sheer extra hours. June Hartwell was clearly capable. I had seen enough in her 12 hours here to know that she was not a woman who broke down or fell apart, that she had a practical intelligence and a composed determination that were worth considerably more than most people gave them credit for. But she was also a stranger, and a woman who had come here under a particular set of circumstances, and it would not be right to simply install her in my dead brother's place without thought. "I have a proposal," I said, "not of the kind my brother intended." I added that quickly because it needed saying, "a practical one." She met my eyes, waited. "The ranch needs help, more than Thomas and I can provide alone. If you're willing to work cooking, tending the kitchen garden, helping with the lighter stock work, I can offer you room and board and a fair wage until spring. Enough to get you back on your feet, enough to give you choices." June was quiet for a long moment. She looked down at her coffee cup, turning it slowly in her hands. "You don't know me," she said. "You don't know if I can do any of those things." "You came to Wyoming alone to marry a stranger," I said. "You stood in a storm without screaming. You slept in a strange man's house with no one to vouch for him and woke up and asked a practical question. That tells me most of what I need to know." She looked up at me sharply. I thought for a moment that I had offended her, that the plainness of my assessment had landed wrong, but then I saw that the look was not offense. It was something else, something that looked, unexpectedly, almost like being seen. "Until spring," she said. "Until spring." She was quiet again. Then, "And what are the rules of this house?" "Honesty," I said. "Hard work, respect, that's all I ask." She extended her hand across the table, steady and deliberate. I shook it. Her hand was small in mine, but her grip was firm, and I noticed, not with anything improper, but simply with the noticing of a man who pays attention to details, because the land has taught him that details matter, that there were calluses on her palm. She had worked before. She was not afraid of it. "All right, Eli Calloway," she said, "until spring." The first week was all work and weather, and the establishing of small, careful habits. June proved herself in the kitchen garden on the second morning, when she looked at the half-collapsed bean trellis and the frost-damaged squash with the eyes of someone who had grown things before, who understood soil and season, and the particular relationship between a plant and the ground it grows in. She didn't ask permission. She simply tied up her skirts and got to work. And by afternoon the trellis was mended and the surviving squash were properly banked against the coming cold, and she came into the kitchen with dirt on her hands, and a satisfaction in her bearing that I recognized as the specific satisfaction of physical work done well. Thomas Littlebird, who I had worried might be skeptical of her presence, surprised me. He took one look at her that first morning, assessed her with the quiet, unhurried attention of a man who has spent his life reading both weather and people, and nodded once. In the way that meant he had decided she was all right. Coming from Thomas, this was a considerable endorsement. She was good with the horses. This surprised me more than the garden. She had grown up, she told me one evening while we were shelling dried beans at the kitchen table in a small town in Missouri where her father had a modest farm. She had ridden since she was young. She wasn't a Wyoming rider. She didn't have the particular ease with rough terrain and sudden weather that the territory requires. But she was confident and quiet around the animals. And Soot, who was particular about strangers and not given to easy affection, accepted her presence in the barn with what I could only describe as equanimity. I watched her in those early days, from whatever respectful distance the work allowed. I am aware of how that sounds, and I want to be honest about what it was and what it wasn't. It wasn't something I did deliberately. It wasn't, at that point, anything I recognized in myself. It was more like the way you notice a fire when you're cold, or the way you notice the sound of rain when you've been in drought. Something present and vivid in a world that had been, for some time, gray with absence. She was funny, which I had not expected. Not in an obvious way, not the kind of funny that announces itself and waits for applause, but quietly, precisely funny, the kind that requires paying attention to catch. One morning I came into the kitchen to find her having a one-sided argument with the cast iron skillet, which was refusing to release the cornbread she'd made, and she was addressing it with a dignified seriousness that made Thomas, who was standing in the doorway behind me, make a sound in his throat that I had never in 11 years heard him make. A laugh. In the evenings after supper we sat by the fire. Sometimes she read. She had brought 3 books in her suitcase, which impressed me. I'd have brought none, and sometimes she mended or sewed, and sometimes we simply talked. About the ranch, about the territory, about the small daily events that are the true substance of any life lived in a place. She asked questions about Wyoming, about the land, the seasons, the cattle, the particular way the light looked on the mountains in the late afternoon, and she listened to the answers with a focused, genuine attention that made talking feel less like the performance I usually found it to be and more like the exchange of something real. I did not talk about Robert, not yet. She did not push. On the 14th day, she found the grave. I was not with her when it happened. She had gone out after breakfast to walk the property. She had taken to doing this, to understanding the geography of the place the way you can only understand it on foot. And I was in the barn with Thomas when I saw her walking up the hill behind the house, toward the stand of aspen where the family plot was. I don't know why I hadn't thought to show her or to warn her. I think I had been avoiding the hill myself, in the way that grieving people avoid the places where grief is stored. I went after her. She was standing in front of Robert's cross when I arrived, the one nearest to the edge of the hill, the most recent, the wood still pale and unweathered. She had her hands clasped in front of her, and she was looking at the inscription, just his name and the dates. And her face, when I came to stand beside her, was the face of someone in the middle of a complicated conversation with themselves. "I'm sorry," I said. "I should have told you sooner." "No," she said, "I should have asked." We stood together for a minute in silence. The aspens were turning. October had arrived fully now, and the leaves were gold and trembling in the cool air, and the mountains to the west were beginning to show their first seasonal snow on the highest peaks. "What was he like?" she asked, and the question was asked not with grief but with a kind of quiet, honest curiosity. She was a practical woman, June Hartwell. She dealt with things straight on. I thought about it. I thought about Robert at 10 years old, when he used to sneak extra feed to the smallest calves because he couldn't stand for anything to go hungry. I thought about Robert learning to play the harmonica badly and playing it constantly with an absolute, cheerful absence of shame. I thought about Robert, 22 years old, sitting at that kitchen table writing letters to a woman in Missouri in his careful, looping hand, trying to describe this hard and beautiful country to someone who had never seen it. "He was the best of us," I said. "He was kinder than the land deserved." June turned to look at me. "And what are you?" The question landed somewhere unexpected. I looked out at the mountains. "I'm the one who stays," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. That steady, storm gray regard that I was beginning to understand was not coldness but depth. The way still water looks cold when it is simply still. "That's not nothing," she said quietly. And then she turned and walked back down the hill, and I stood there alone for another minute with my brother's name on a wooden cross and October gold all around me, and something moving in my chest that I wasn't ready to name. By November, the easy separation of their lives had begun to erode. Not because either of them sought it, but because the ranch required it. Winter in Wyoming does not permit distance. When the cold arrives in earnest, the killing cold that comes down from the north like a judgment, turning the world to iron and ice, every resource concentrates toward survival. The livestock need twice the care. The firewood needs constant replenishment. The house needs sealing against drafts. The days are short and the dark is long, and the work that needs doing is the kind best done by more than one pair of hands. I found myself aware of her, in the way that you become aware of warmth. It crept up on me, the way the best and most dangerous things do, slowly enough that by the time I noticed it, it had been true for some time. I noticed the sound of her moving in the kitchen in the mornings, the specific quality of the sound she made, the knock of the kettle, the scrape of the skillet, the occasional quiet sound she made when something amused her, and I noticed that these sounds had become, somewhere along the way, part of the architecture of my mornings, part of what made the dark hours before dawn bearable. I noticed the way she looked in firelight. I noticed the way her hands moved when she talked about something that interested her, a quick, precise expressiveness that was different from her usual composure, like a fire seen through a window. I noticed that when she smiled, fully, unreservedly smiled, which was rare and therefore significant, the whole quality of the room changed. None of this was something I said. None of it was anything I acted on. I'm not a man given to impulsive movement in any direction, and I had in addition every practical reason in the world to keep what I was feeling precisely where it was. She was here until spring. She had come here as my brothers intended. She was rebuilding herself from a circumstance that I was partially responsible for creating. Any complication I added to that situation was a complication she had not asked for and did not deserve. So I was careful. I was measured. I was, I believed, doing an excellent job of keeping what I felt behind the wall where it belonged. I had, apparently, not accounted for Thomas. "You look at her," Thomas said one morning in the barn, not looking up from the harness he was mending. I kept forking hay. "Thomas," I said, "I'm just saying. I know what you're saying." "She looks back," he said very quietly, and went back to the harness and said no more about it, because Thomas never said more than was required. I kept forking hay, but my hands had gone slightly unsteady, and it took me a moment to recover them. The second storm came in December. This one was different from the autumn storm that had brought June to my door. Not angry and dramatic, but quiet, determined. The true Wyoming winter making its argument in the language of white silence. It started in the afternoon, and by nightfall had buried the yard in 2 feet of snow with no sign of stopping, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that kills livestock and freezes water in pipes, and makes the wood of the house contract and crack like rifle shots in the dark. Thomas had gone home before the storm hit. It was just the two of us. We worked through the evening doing what needed doing. I went out 3 times in the dark to tend the livestock, while June kept the fires going and the snow packed away from the door thresholds. And by 9 o'clock we had done everything that could be done, and the house was warm and the animals were safe, and there was nothing left to do but sit by the fire and wait for morning. She was sitting on the floor in front of the hearth. Not in the chair, on the floor with her back against the chair's legs and her knees drawn up to her chest, her socked feet close to the fire. She had a blanket around her shoulders, and her braid had come somewhat undone during the evening's work, loose dark strands falling around her face. She was looking into the fire with the expression I had come to recognize as her thinking face, not blank, not absent, but deeply, privately engaged with something. I sat in the chair behind her. Or I started to sit in the chair and then stopped and sat on the floor instead, my back against the other chair, 4 feet between us with the fire in the middle. She looked at me when I settled, one quick look and then back to the fire. "Tell me something," she said. This was a thing she did, not often, but sometimes, in the evenings when the quiet had been long enough. A door she opened to let something in. "What kind of something?" I said. "Something true, something you don't usually say." I looked at the fire. "I was going to sell the ranch," I said. "After Robert died, I had for about 2 weeks I had nearly decided to sell it, go somewhere else, start something else." A pause, the fire crackled. "What stopped you?" she asked. "I couldn't figure out where else I would go," I said. And I realized that being unable to leave wasn't the same as wanting to stay. That wanting to stay had to be its own thing. "Did you find it?" she asked. "The wanting to stay?" I looked at the back of her head, at the loose strand of dark hair that had fallen across her shoulder. "Yes," I said, "gradually." She was quiet. The snow pressed against the windows with a sound like held breath. "My turn," she said. "All right." I wasn't. She stopped, turned her head slightly, not enough to look at me but enough to indicate the turn of her thoughts. "I wasn't in love with your brother, I want to be honest about that. We exchanged letters and he was clearly a good man, a kind man, and I respected what he was building here. But love," she paused. "Love was something I was prepared to hope for, eventually. I thought that was honest enough as a place to start." Something shifted in the room, something in the quality of the air between us. "That was honest," I said. "I feel I owe him honesty," she said, "since he can't ask for it himself." I watched the firelight move on her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the curve of her cheekbone, the way her lashes cast shadows when she looked down. "June," I said. She turned to look at me fully, then turned around, the blanket sliding off one shoulder, and met my eyes across the firelit space between us. And there it was, the thing Thomas had seen and named before I was ready to. In her eyes, not hidden, not performed, but quietly, honestly present, a reflection of the thing I had been trying so carefully not to name in myself. It lasted only a moment. She looked away first. "Good night, Eli," she said, and gathered her blanket and stood up and went to her room, and I sat by the fire for a long time afterward, listening to the snow settle around the house. I found the letter in January. She hadn't hidden it exactly. It had fallen from her coat pocket, the coat she hung by the door, and was lying on the floor when I came in from the morning feeding. I would have left it. I would absolutely have left it, except that the name on the front of the envelope, the return name in a hand I didn't know, was not any name I expected, and I couldn't help seeing, as I bent to pick it up, the first line that was visible through the back of the open envelope. "You can still come home. He would forgive you, just come back." I left the letter on the kitchen table and went to do the rest of the morning work. When she came downstairs and saw it, she went still in the doorway for a moment. Then she picked it up, folded it in half, and put it in her pocket with a movement that was deliberate and closed. "It's from my brother," she said without me asking, "in Missouri." "You don't have to explain," I said. "I know." She went to the stove, started the coffee. Her back was to me, her shoulders set with that careful control I knew. "He thinks I made a mistake coming here." "Did you?" I asked. The question was out before I considered it fully. She poured the water, didn't answer immediately. "I don't know yet," she said finally. It was the most honest thing she could have said. I understood that, and I held it carefully, the way you hold something that is both a gift and a weight. We didn't speak of it again. But I thought about it all day, about the word forgive in her brother's letter, about the thing it suggested, about the layers of June Hartwell that I had not yet seen, about the fact that she had come to Wyoming not just for a practical arrangement but from something else, something she had needed to leave behind. And I felt, not for the first time and not for the last, The particular ache of knowing that someone you care about is carrying something heavy and having no right, yet, to ask them to set it down. His name was Carter Hale, and he arrived in February. He was a cattle broker from Cheyenne, a handsome man, well-dressed for the territory, with an easy manner and the particular confidence of someone who is accustomed to getting what he wants in most situations. He came to negotiate the purchase of a portion of my spring herd, which was legitimate business, and he stayed 2 days because the road was bad, which was legitimate weather. And during those 2 days he directed at June Hartwell a quality of attention that was both entirely proper and, to me, unbearable. I watched him charm her over the dinner table on the first evening, watched him lean forward when she spoke, ask her questions with the practiced interest of a man who knows how to make a woman feel remarkable, make her laugh with a story about Cheyenne society that was genuinely funny, damn him. Watch June, my June, I thought, and then caught myself on the possessive and felt a cold shame, respond with animation, her eyes bright, more openly talkative than I had seen her in weeks. I was not a pleasant person to be around that evening. Thomas, who had come for supper, looked at me once across the table with an expression of calm, resigned knowledge. I excused myself early and went to the barn. I stood in the dark of the barn with my horse for a long time, aware of how unreasonable I was being and unable to stop being it. She had no obligation to me. She was here for the winter for practical reasons, and come spring she would have choices, and those choices were hers to make. I had offered her nothing. I had said nothing. I had, in fact, been scrupulously careful to say and offer nothing, and I could not now be angry that she was responding to the attentions of a man who was straightforwardly interested and unafraid to show it. I could not be angry. I was angry. The second day I kept my distance. I was civil. I conducted the business negotiations and made the arrangements, and I was, by any external measure, a perfectly reasonable host. But I was not warm. I was not present in the way I had been. And when Carter Hale made his polite goodbyes and June walked with him to the door and they stood talking for a few minutes on the threshold, I went into the back room and I did not watch. That evening, June came into the barn while I was doing the late feeding. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked to Soot's stall and leaned against the post, her arms folded, watching me. "Are you going to tell me what I did?" she said. "I kept working." "You didn't do anything," I said. "Eli." The way she said my name. Just that, just the single syllable, with a precision of address that meant, look at me. I am speaking to the real version of you, not the version that keeps its feelings behind its back. I stopped, turned to face her. She was looking at me steadily, and her expression was not anger, not accusation, but something more difficult. It was the look of someone asking for honesty, and knowing that the honesty might hurt both of them. "I don't have any right to feel what I feel," I said. "I know that." "What do you feel?" she said. The lantern light swung slightly in the winter draft. Soot shifted in his stall. Somewhere in the far pasture, one of the cattle lowed. "I don't know how to say it without," I stopped, tried again, "without making it into something you didn't ask for, something unfair." "I'm asking now." She said, "I'm asking you to say it." The silence stretched between us, full of the weight of everything I'd been holding for months. The cold air of the barn, the smell of hay and horses and wood smoke from the house, the specific, held quality of the moment before a thing changes. "I don't want you to leave in spring," I said, "and I know that's not a fair thing to put on you. And I know what you came here for and what I am and what I'm not, and I am not asking you for anything. I'm just—" I looked at her. "I'm just done pretending that it isn't true." June looked at me for a long moment. Then she unfolded her arms, and she walked to where I was standing, and she stopped 2 feet from me, close enough that I could see the individual dark strands of hair at her temple, close enough to see the exact color of her eyes in the lantern light, not just gray, but layered, complex, the color of deep water with light moving in it. and she said quietly, "I know you don't make things up. That's one of the things she stopped herself. Her chin lifted slightly. That's one of the things I've noticed about you." We stood like that for a moment that felt much longer than a moment. Then she took a breath and she stepped back and she looked at the ground and she said, "I need to think." "Of course," I said. She left the barn. I stood in the dark with my horse, and my heart was doing something it hadn't done in a long time, and the Wyoming cold was blowing under the barn door. And I felt, for the first time in months, that I was standing on ground that was not entirely stable, and that the instability, terrifying as it was also something else. Also something close to being alive. She was different after that. Not cold, not unkind, but there was a careful quality to her movements around me, a slight, deliberate increase in the space between us when we were in the same room, a new formality in her manner that had not been there before. She was thinking. I could see it in her, the internal deliberation, the weighing of things, the particular drawn quality around her eyes that meant she was not sleeping as well as she had been. I gave her the space she needed. It cost me, but I gave it. What I had not expected was the loneliness of it. I had been lonely before June arrived. I knew that particular companionship of solitude, the way it settles into your bones over time, becomes part of the furniture of your days, a thing you stop noticing because you have no comparison. But now I had a comparison. Now I knew what it felt like to have someone at the breakfast table whose presence changed the quality of the morning. I knew what it felt like to hear her laugh, to see her reading by the fire, to work alongside someone whose silences were inhabited rather than empty. And the new careful distance between us was not the old solitude. It was worse, because it was the absence of something I had already learned to know. Thomas noticed. He didn't say anything, because Thomas doesn't say things that aren't necessary. But he brought extra firewood to the house one evening and stayed for coffee. And we sat at the kitchen table, the three of us, with the new careful space between June and me. And Thomas told a long, meandering story about a horse he had known in his youth that I had never heard him tell before. And he told it in such a way that it required both June and me to respond. And by the end of the story, we were both talking somewhat normally, and I understood that Thomas had done this on purpose, because Thomas is, underneath his extraordinary silence, one of the kinder people I have ever known. One night in the middle of February, I heard her crying. I was awake in the early hours, 3 in the morning, the worst hour, the hour when everything unresolved comes calling, and I heard through the wall the unmistakable, carefully muffled sound of someone crying in a way they are trying very hard not to be heard. It was brief. She stopped herself quickly. But I lay there in the dark listening to the silence after, and the helplessness of it, being 10 feet away from someone in pain and having no right to do anything about it, was a particular kind of difficult. In the morning, she was composed and present and showed no sign of the night, and I did not mention it, because she had not meant for me to hear. But I brought extra wood to her room that morning and left it without comment. She said nothing about it, but that evening at supper the careful distance had shortened slightly, just slightly, 1 degree of warmth recovered from the cold. It was Thomas who told me, on a Tuesday in early March. He came to find me in the south pasture, where I was checking on a heifer that had been off her feed. He rode up alongside me and looked at the mountains for a moment in the way he has, patient, gathering himself, and then he said, "She's writing to her brother." I kept looking at the heifer. All right. She's writing to tell him she's coming back in spring. I was quiet for a moment. "It's her choice," I said. "Yes," Thomas said, "I thought you should know." He rode away. I stood with the heifer in the cold March air and looked at the mountains, which were still mostly white, their peaks hard and bright against a sky that was, for the first time in months, genuinely, cleanly blue. I thought about June Hartwell writing that letter. I thought about her brother in Missouri, with his offer of forgiveness. He would forgive you. Just come back. And I thought about what it meant that she was going back, what it meant about what she was going back to, and I thought about the word forgive again and what it was she needed to be forgiven for. And for the first time, I let myself fully face the question I had been carefully not asking. That evening, I knocked on the door of her room. She opened it. She was in the middle of writing. There was paper on the small table she used as a desk, and ink on the side of her hand. She looked at me, and something in my face told her that this was a different kind of conversation. "Come in," she said, and stepped back. I came in. I stood by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed, which was the only other sitting place in the room, and she looked up at me with those eyes, and she was, I could see it, could see the preparation in her posture, ready to be honest. She had been getting ready for this. Part of her, I thought, had been expecting it. "Tell me about Missouri," I said. A pause. "What about it?" "The thing your brother thinks needs forgiving." She was very still. The candle on her desk threw a warm, unsteady light. Outside, the last of the winter dark pressed against the window. "There was a woman," she said. I waited. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She was looking at the floor. "We grew up together. She stopped. When she started again, her voice had shifted to the careful, quiet register of something spoken for the first time, or the first time in a long time. "We were everything to each other for a long time, in a way that people where we lived didn't have words for, or if they had words, the words weren't kind ones." The candle flame swayed. "Her family moved her away," June continued. "Married her to a man in Kansas City. And my brother, who had always known, I think, even when I didn't fully know it myself, told me that I needed to start over, build something clean, something that made sense in the world." She raised her eyes to mine. "Hence the advertisement, hence Wyoming, hence—" a slight, painful motion of her hand that encompassed the room, the house, everything. "Hence all of this." I held everything she had said carefully. "I am not asking you to forgive me anything," she said. Her chin was up. Her eyes were steady. She was, I thought, one of the bravest people I had ever been in a room with. "I'm not asking you to understand it or accept it or—" "June," I said. She stopped. "I'm not going to tell you that changes anything," I said. "I'm going to tell you that it doesn't." She looked at me. The steadiness in her expression cracked, just slightly, just at the edges like ice in spring. "You don't have to say that," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm saying it because it's true." I looked at her. "You came here honest. You've been honest with me every day since. The honesty you're offering me now is the same kind." I paused. "What you felt for her was real. I can see that it was. I wouldn't ask you to set it down or pretend it wasn't, and I wouldn't want the version of you that had." June was quiet for a long moment. Then very quietly, "And what you feel for me is also real," I said. "I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I'm not asking you to stay. I'm just—" I stopped, found the honest end of the sentence. "I wanted you to know that you are known here, that what you are is not a problem to be solved, that you don't have to go back to be forgiven." The crack at the edges of her expression spread. "Not falling apart, not breaking. Something else, the way wood opens along the grain when it is finally treated right, the way a door opens when the right key finds it." She stood up. She crossed the small space between us, and she put both hands on either side of my face, tilted up to look at me, and her eyes, those deep, storm-gray, ocean-painted eyes, were full of a feeling that I had no words for and needed none. "Eli Calloway," she said softly, "you are the most unexpected thing that has ever happened to me." "Likewise," I said. My voice was not entirely steady. She almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that contains everything the smile would mean if it arrived. "I don't know what I am yet," she said, "or what I'm capable of, or what." "I know," I said. "I'm not asking for certainty. I'm just asking for the chance to find out alongside you, if you want that." She was very close, the warmth of her hands on my face, the candle light between us. "I have to think," she said for the second time. "I know," I said. She lowered her hands. I stepped back, and I left her room, and the door closed quietly behind me, and I went to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark for a very long time. 3 days passed. I did not push. I did not watch her. I did the work of the ranch, and I was present at meals, and I tried to be simply myself, without the weight of waiting on it, without making the air between us heavy with what hadn't been decided. She needed space to think, and I could give her that. It was perhaps the most purely honest thing I knew how to offer. On the third evening, she came into the barn. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, had walked all the way out from the house with them, in the cold, steam rising from both cups, and she held one out to me without a word. I took it. She sat on the hay bale across from where I was working and wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at me. "I burned the letter," she said. I held my coffee cup, waited. "The one I was writing to my brother." She looked down at her coffee. "I sat with it for 2 days and then I burned it." "Why?" I asked. She looked up at me, and there was something new in her expression. Not the careful composure of someone managing difficult feelings, not the brave steadiness of someone prepared to be honest. This was something simpler, something opened. "Because I don't want to go back," she said. "Not because of you, not only because of you, but because," she stopped, gathered. "Because I came here to start something, something new, something that was mine, and I think perhaps this place." Her eyes moved briefly around the barn, the winter dark beyond the door, the particular quality of this land I had grown up on. "I think it might be big enough for what I am." A pause. "All of what I am." I set my coffee down. I crossed the space between us, and I offered her my hand, open, palm up, the way you offer something you want to give without demanding it be taken. She looked at my hand. Then she reached out slowly and placed her hand in mine. Her fingers were warm from the coffee cup. They curled around mine with a gentleness that was also a kind of grip, not desperate, not clinging, but decided. The grip of a person who has made a choice and means it. We stayed like that for a long time in the quiet barn, with the Wyoming winter dark around us and the warmth of 2 cups of coffee, and the sound of the horses breathing and the distant, patient stars. No words. Some things don't need them. March came with the particular cruelty of Wyoming spring, not warmth, but the promise of warmth, days that rise to almost gentle and then pull back, as if the land is testing whether you mean to stay before it commits to being beautiful for you. The first crocus appeared in the kitchen garden on a Thursday morning. June found it, crouching down to look at it with an expression so nakedly delighted that I had to look away for a moment. Not because the delight was inappropriate, but because it was so completely, transparently genuine that it felt almost private. Thomas showed up that morning with his wife, Hannah, a small, sharp-eyed woman who had been curious about June since November and had, with Thomas's characteristic patience, waited to express that curiosity until the time was right. She arrived with bread and dried berries, and an assessment of June Hartwell that took approximately 4 minutes, after which she decided they would be friends, and proceeded to act on this decision with an efficiency that left June looking slightly dazed and deeply pleased. The three of them sat at my kitchen table while I worked, and the sound of their conversation, Hannah's quick, precise observations, Thomas's rare, well-aimed contributions, and June's voice threaded through it all, steadily more relaxed, more itself, was the best sound the house had made since before Robert died. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the back room for a moment, listening. June looked up and caught my eye. She smiled. The real one, the full one, the rare one, and it was everything I had thought it would be, the way the room changed when she brought it out. It was like the crocus in the garden, small, improbable, survived the winter. I smiled back. It was the last Saturday of March. The snow had retreated to the high ground. The pastures were coming back, that first, tentative green, almost more color than substance, but real. The air had a warmth in it that the February air had not, a suggestion of the season turning toward life. We were walking the fence line, checking posts in the south pasture, a task that takes most of a morning if done properly, and we had been walking in the good, easy silence of people who have grown comfortable with each other's company. The mountains were clear. A hawk was describing slow circles above the far meadow. The sky was the particular blue that Wyoming offers after a long winter, as if the season owes you a debt and is beginning to pay it. June had been quieter than usual all morning, not unhappy, not withdrawn, but privately occupied with something. She stopped at the third post from the east corner and looked at it for a moment, her hands in her jacket pockets. "I wrote to Clara," she said, "2 weeks ago." I looked at her. Not to try to recover anything," she said. "Just to say," she paused, "to say that I hoped she was well, to say that I had found something, that I was all right." She glanced at me sidelong. "I thought she deserved to know that." "She did," I said. June looked at the mountains. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said, about this place being big enough for all of what I am." She looked at me. "Did you mean it?" "Yes," I said. "Everything that is true in you is something I want to know, not some of it, all of it." She was quiet. "I'm not entirely certain," she said carefully, "what I am capable of, what shape this takes, what it is going forward." She turned to face me fully, and her expression was the most open I had ever seen it, all the careful composure set aside, laid down deliberately like armor put away. "But I know that I do not want to be anywhere else. I know that this," her hand moved between us, "this is real, whatever it is, I know it's real." "That's enough," I said. "That's more than enough." She stepped forward. She was close enough that I could see the wind catching the loose strands of her hair, close enough to see every layer of gray in her eyes, every shadow of every feeling that had passed through them over the winter, the grief and the adjustment and the careful distance, and the honesty and the fear and the decision and the crocus in March delight. She reached up and touched the side of my face, just her fingertips, just for a moment. And then she stepped forward the remaining distance, and she put her head against my chest, and I put my arms around her gently, the way you hold something that has survived a long winter and come through to spring. We stood there in the Wyoming morning. The hawk moved across the sky. The grass was green at the roots. The mountains were clear and permanent, and the sky was the kind of blue that means the world intends to continue. Spring became summer. Summer brought the long, golden days and the hard cattle work and Thomas and Hannah's regular Sunday suppers that had become, without any formal arrangement, a permanent feature of our weeks. Hannah had taken on the project of the kitchen garden with June, and the two of them had turned it into something considerably more ambitious than I had previously maintained. New beds, new arrangements, a small herb plot along the south wall that smelled extraordinary in the afternoon heat. I watched June become more herself every week. Not a different person, not transformed, not healed in some neat, story-shaped way. She still had the careful composure when she needed it, still had the particular reserve with strangers that I now understood as a natural feature of her character and not a wound. She still had the letter from Clara that she'd received in April, which she had read twice and folded and placed in the drawer of her desk, and which she had spoken to me about in the way she spoke about complicated things, directly, honestly, without dramatics. Clara was well. Clara was married. Clara hoped June was happy. They would probably not correspond again, and June held the weight of that with the kind of grown-up, open-eyed sadness that doesn't ask for rescue and doesn't pretend not to be there. I didn't try to fix it, I just stayed near. Robert's harmonica. I had found it in his desk the previous winter and kept it because I couldn't throw it away. June had discovered in June, and had taught herself to play it badly, which she did in the evenings with a complete absence of self-consciousness that I recognized, with a pang, as pure Robert. She played it badly and she did not care, and the sound of it, terrible and cheerful, filled the house in the evenings and made the house feel different than it had in a long time. Not like Robert was here. Like something new had grown in the place where he had been. In the evenings, we sat on the front porch after supper and watched the light change on the mountains, the way the gold deepened to amber to red, the shadows building in the valleys, the sky moving through its changes, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and both were good, and both were full of something that I was content at last not to have a name for. Names are for things that need to be held in place. What we had didn't need holding. It was already rooted. It had wintered well. She was still here. Not because of the arrangement my brother had made. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Not because she was making the best of a situation that had gone wrong. She was here because she had chosen it. Chosen this place, this hard and beautiful country, this life of early mornings and cold winters, and the 10,000 small and necessary tasks that keep a ranch breathing. Chosen, with her eyes open and her past fully known and her complicated, whole, remarkable self fully present. She had chosen to stay. And on a Thursday evening in July, when the air was warm and the first stars were coming out over the mountains, she sat beside me on the porch steps, not in her chair beside me, her shoulder against mine, the warmth of her presence as natural by now as the warmth of the fire, and she looked up at the darkening sky and she said, "Eli." "Yes." "I'm glad the storm came." A pause. "I'm glad I was in the road." I looked at her profile, the curve of her jaw, the clean, clear line of her looking up at the sky. "So am I said. She leaned her head against my shoulder. The stars came out over Wyoming, one by one, patient and permanent, the way they always do. And the ranch breathed. And the road was empty. And everything that needed to be said had been said.